This video will look at calculating percentages mentally. In this first example, I have £240. In order to calculate any mental percentage, we always work out 10% first. 10% is the same as dividing by 10. So 240 divided by 10, in this case, is £24. Having found 10%, we would now always find 5%, because 5% is half of whatever 10% was. So in this case, 5% is equal to £12. These are now classed as our two building blocks. We can now use these building blocks to work out any percentage of £240 as long as it is a multiple of 5. So for example, 15% of £240 would be the 10% block, which was worth £24, plus the 5% block, which in this case was £12, give me an answer of £36. In the next example, 30% of £240, you would have 3 of the 10% building blocks. So that's 3 lots of £24, which would be £72. There are so many different ways of doing this. Some people may have spotted that to go from 15% to 30%, I just times by 2. So I would do the same to the answer. Another example would be for, say, a smaller amount of money, £44. So once again, I would work out 10%. Now when I divide by 10 this time, it's not as simple as knocking a naught off because a naught isn't there. So 44 divided by 10 is £4.40. Once again, 5% would be half of this, giving me £2.20. And I have worked out my two building blocks. So choosing some different percentages this time, let's choose, say, 45%. Now this could be done again in two ways. I could have 4 lots of 10%, so that would be 4 lots of £4.40, which would be £17.60. Then I would have to add on 5%, which was £2.20, give me a grand total of £19.80. Some people might have noticed that 45% is 50%, take away 5%. Now remembering that 50% is a half, all we have to do is take half of £44, which is £22, and take away the 5% building block, which is £2.20, leaving me with the £19.80. So that's another way of doing it. In this final example, I've got £14, and once again I would work out my 10% building blocks and my 5% building blocks, giving me £1.40, and half of that is 70p. Now, if the question was a little bit harder and it asked for 16% of the £14, I would have a problem. I would have the 10% and the 5%, but that would only get me to 15%. I would need to now work out what 1% was. Now, to find out what 1% of the £14 is, I would take my answer to the 10% and I would divide by 10 once again. So £1.40 divided by 10 is 14p. So I've now got a brand new building block. So armed with these 3 building blocks, to work out 16%, I would take my answer to 10%, I would add on my answer to 5%, and I would add on my answer to 1%. And those 3 values would give me the answer to 16% of £14, which is £2.24.